Good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see all of your faces and names joining us this afternoon for our second Lunch and Learn series. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be part of this really important dialogue. We have people joining through the waiting room, so we'll give it about another minute just to get everyone a chance to get in before we kick off today. All right. We are at 12:01 and I know time is valuable and we only have an hour together today and a lot to cover. I want to make sure our panelists have ample time to dig into today's discussion. So we'll go ahead and get started. So hello everyone and good afternoon. I'm Chelsea Haring-Cozzi, the Executive Director for the Coalition for Homelessness Intervention and Prevention, or better known as CHIP Indy to many of you. And welcome to CHIP's 2020 Celebration Series. This is our second Lunch and Learn session on homelessness, housing, and racial inequity. Like so many of you, we have reimagined how we're engaging the community this year and have landed on a series of Lunch and Learns over the next several months on key topics related to homelessness. Our culminating event will be the evening of December 9th at 5 p.m. as we recognize and celebrate community partners, advocates, and providers. And we sure hope you can join us that evening. While this is a free series of events, if you feel compelled to donate, you can check us out on our website at chipindy.org. For those of you who already have, we thank you. We also want to thank a few of our sponsors today. We so appreciate your support. Special thank you to series sponsor, Barnes and Thornburg, event sponsor, the Central Indiana Community Foundation, and supporting sponsors, Park Mobile and Regions Bank. We would also like to give a special thanks to our phenomenal panel today, who will be introduced and who you will hear from in just a few moments. A couple housekeeping reminders for our virtual environment. Please remain on mute. Please utilize the chat box for any comments or questions, and we will be monitoring that and should have some time at the end to open up to questions. And please note that we are recording today's session and we'll make it available on the CHIP website. So let's introduce today's topic and today's panelist. Today's topic opens up a dialogue on the prevalence and consistent and continued persistence of racial disparity in homelessness and housing. While today's discussion will only scratch the surface, it will provide an overview into the intersectionality of race, housing, and homelessness that we hope sparks continued and intentional examination and, most importantly, action. To lay the foundation for this topic, I will set the stage with some facts and then turn it over to our distinguished panel for a moderated discussion. So let's set the stage a little bit. Nationally, Black people comprise of 40% of people experiencing homelessness, despite only being 13% of the general population. In Indianapolis, in any given year, Black people comprise of at least 50% of those experiencing homelessness, despite only being 29% of the Marion County total population. Black people are more likely to become homeless than any other racial group, and oftentimes remain homeless longer and return to homelessness at disproportionate rates than any other racial group. This disparity speaks to the systemic nature of racism and discrimination that exists in our communities that goes well beyond explanations of homelessness and poverty. As stated previously, homelessness often mirrors everything else that is broken across our systems. That is inclusive of criminal justice system, education system, healthcare systems, and those inequities are reflected in our homeless system as well. As a result, the dialogue must shift from talking about the people experiencing homelessness to the structures and systems that are perpetuating racial inequities. Without further ado, I'd like to then introduce our panel today to dive deeper into this dialogue. There is absolutely no way I can do justice to the work and biographies of today's panelists in this brief intro. They each have extensive biographies that speak to the depth and breadth of the work they do in the community to educate, advocate, and advance social justice. Their passions, expertise, and leadership are invaluable to dismantling and rebuilding equitable systems of care in Indianapolis. In addition to their day jobs, and I use day jobs in quotes and very lightly, because their work is not defined by and doesn't stop during the workday or work week. In addition, they all serve on the Blueprint Council to End Homelessness and lend their leadership and expertise to our collective work here in Indianapolis. So without further delay, we are honored to introduce today's panelists. And you can read more about their biographies in today's Evite invitation. Dr. Breanca Merritt is joining us and is founding director of the Center for Research on Inclusion and Social Policy, or CRISP, at IU's Public Policy Institute, and serves as assistant professor at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Reverend David Greene Sr. is senior pastor of the Second Baptist Church Purpose of Life Ministries here in Indianapolis. Ray Lay is an Indiana certified recovery peer specialist, a VA mental health intensive case management team member, and a person with more lived experience and expertise than anyone I know, honestly, and a huge advocate. And William Bumphus is director of Men's Emergency Shelter for Wheeler Mission and assistant pastor for Faith Center International Church. Thank you to our esteemed panelists today. So with that, I would like to begin our moderated discussion. And again, as you have questions or comments, please utilize the chat box to add that commentary. So Ray, we're going to begin with you, and I'm going to ask the first question to you and then open it up to any other panelists that would like to chime in. And I'll remind you before you answer to unmute yourself. So Ray, let's start with you. Black people, as I mentioned in the introduction, are overrepresented in homelessness here in Indianapolis and continue to be disproportionately impacted by homelessness. From your perspective, what are the factors that are contributing to racial disparities in homelessness here in Indianapolis?
Thank you very much, Chelsea, and good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to our panel discussion. Exact reasons or factors I cannot state. I can best state what I consider some of the myths. The myths, I believe, could be attributed to that myth of genitalia measurement, that myth of also where did life start, that myth of supremacy. But being a person that I did experience homelessness for over 10 years, I cannot state that systemic racism was a contributing factor, but I can state that I'm well aware that racism and systemic racism is a problem here in the United States. I also am a honorably discharged United States Marine. When I first got to boot camp, my senior drill instructor did something that cemented the fact that human beings are human beings. He actually hit a Black recruit, he hit a Hispanic recruit, and he hit a Caucasian recruit, all in the mouth, and made them all bleed. And he made them all parade around the squad bay, showing everybody the color of the blood. Reason being was for that to hammer home that point that regardless of what you might be your pigmentation or melanin makeup, the fact is you're still a human being and we all bleed the same. And that is still also the same part about, according to Maslow's hierarchy, all human beings deserve to be sheltered, fed, and clothed, unless you want us to all run around here in our birthday suits, which I'm kind of sure it wouldn't be kind of a happy part. But um, I do believe, though, that that's the part of is more myths and people uh, buying into the myths and their learned experience or learned teachings to try to hold Black people down. Okay. And I've learned that when you try to hold a person down, that takes two hands to hold a person down. That means you cannot help yourself. That's one major aspect. And also, there's the other aspect that uh, it's just downright counterproductive.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
Any other panelists want to add to the discussion around what factors, from your perspective, are contributing to racial disparity here in Indianapolis for those experiencing homelessness?
I would like to add that the high unemployment rate among African Americans, as well as the high eviction rate for African Americans, also contribute to the homelessness rate.
Any other panelists want to chime in? You have to unmute, William, if you're jumping in.
Yeah, I was trying to see if Dr. Merritt was going to respond as well. I mean, I think that, you know, you mentioned kind of some of the things that we see systematically, right? That affects African Americans traditionally here in America and in our city, right? So I think that when you look at the factors, and again, I think you mentioned this as well, is that if it's that way in certain systems, then it goes downhill, right? If the criminal justice system is unequal, right? And if there's not equity there, then that's going to flow into everything else, right? A lot of guys that we see coming into the shelter are guys who come from the prison population, right? So once they are released from prison back into society, they are immediately put into a homeless shelter where they are already behind, right? So I think, you know, when we talk about, and we're probably not on the part of fixing those things yet, right? But when we talk about fixing those things and understanding those things, I think it's important that we first recognize that there's an issue, and not just, right, us on the call, right? I think everybody got to understand and recognize that there's an issue. In those ways, we can kind of slow down the impact that those systems have on the homeless population, right, amongst African Americans, and it being disproportionately that way in the homeless shelter.
And William, do you see that disproportionately directly played out inside the men's shelter?
Oh yeah, I definitely see it. I was looking at the numbers last night, and over the course of the last 10 years, it's been, you know, 58% African Americans that come through these doors compared to 34% of Caucasian Americans. And I don't never look at Asian Americans or Latinos or anything like that, because that number is usually low, less than 3%. But I did also see that, you know, that number starting to rise for Latino citizens coming into the shelter, that number has gone up 3% in the last 4 months. So, you know, I think that when we talk about the system, and right now we're talking about for African Americans, but I think that's across cultures, right? For minorities, period, here in America, I think that number or that system shows up in everything that we see, including in the homeless shelter.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to just mention too, that's an important, I think an important data point to mention, William, is that according to our point in time count data year in and year out, as well as our annualized data that we collect at CHIP, we also see that Black people show up in homelessness differently and distinctly. And so as William is mentioning, there is a higher prevalence and disproportionality of Black people in particular and Black men in shelters and Black women in family shelters. So when you look at the shelter population, that is very much disproportionate and even higher disproportionality than the overall homeless population. And that's important, I think, when we as a community start to look at where people are showing up and how resources and interventions are targeted, particularly if we're using racial equity as a lens to be able to ensure people have access to resources. Dr. Merritt, did you want to add to, from your perspective, the factors contributing to disproportionality in homelessness here?
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted me to talk a little more about kind of systems and the role that they play in homelessness and just housing, I guess, in general. So I think everyone so far has talked really well about just, you know, that it's not just about the individual, that it's about, you know, structures and other things that play a role. But I think everyone's kind of touched on different things that are very individually focused. And so to Ray's point about myths, I think, you know, for some folks, there's this idea that, you know, if you have enough income, then you can afford housing, and then that way you're not homeless. And so I think a lot of folks has been on kind of these individual level things that might prevent people from getting that income to therefore afford housing. But it's much more complicated than that. I think centering this conversation on anti-Black areas that have, you know, prevented equitable housing opportunities is really the place to start, because, you know, historically, it kind of didn't matter how much income you had as a Black person in particular. The system was really designed to not be equitable for Black people in particular, not just people of color. And so that it's really kind of historically been not just, you know, a government thing or a nonprofit thing. It's always been kind of multiple sectors working together and separately to kind of perpetuate these issues. So when we talk about access to housing, what does affordable housing mean? If we look across the city, we know that there are folks who, where, you know, even if they could afford it, just the lack of supply of affordable housing is an issue. Historically, you know, Black folks have been segregated within Indianapolis, or, you know, moved out of neighborhoods in which they lived, including, you know, in your IEPUI. And so this idea is, oh, we can just move somewhere else. But, you know, at the same time, the city even then was, you know, restructuring its rezoning laws so that Black folks could not live in certain areas despite their income or employment, et cetera. So we see that historically, locally. When we think about things like income, median household income has always been substantially lower for Black folks compared to white people in the city. Even right now, I think there's about a, you know, $20,000 to $30,000 difference between those, probably about $20,000 difference between Black people and white people in the city. And so when we think about, oh, income needed to afford to live in a certain place, it's just not a thing. I think when we think about individual level issues, Ray brought up the point of, you know, veterans coming back to serve or from service. Even if you're honorably discharged, we know that those folks are more likely to have mental health diagnoses, substance abuse issues. And so when we have kind of a community that really kind of stigmatizes those things, and particularly within Black communities, it's kind of worse. And so when we think about what it means to seek help and receive help, we know those folks are more likely to become homeless. You know, we have not historically, as a city or as a country, really provided supports in those ways. And so I think Pastor Greene talked about employment, another major issue when we talk about, you know, what it means to get a job, to have income as well. You know, William talked about criminal justice history. Those things are very much related. Can you get a job if you've been incarcerated? And if Black people and brown people are more likely to be incarcerated, what does that mean for your ability to get stable housing? So I think at very high levels, even before you even get to homelessness, just the instability pieces are crucial. And we see things like, mental health diagnoses, substance abuse issues kind of exacerbating that. And we see it particularly in the Black community where folks are maybe less likely to speak out or get help. So kind of this confluence of both, how structures keep these things going, as well as, how systems are created to respond to the individual and not necessarily to the bigger systemic issues that would help make that a little better.
Thank you for that, Dr. Merritt. And I think what you're all hearing and touching on is, again, the notion that by the time somebody experiences homelessness and gets to that place where they are living unhoused, typically they have been failed in so many other places by other systems. So discrimination in the criminal justice system that is disproportionately impacting Black people and specifically Black men. You have discrimination or disparities in employment and wage gaps that are disproportionately impacting Black people. And then as you touched on, discrimination in housing policies and practices that are also locking specifically Black folks out of housing access and opportunities across the city. Dr. Merritt, I'm going to stay with you for a moment for the next question, really digging into some of those systemic factors. And I want to talk a little more in depth about eviction. I think we've talked in this community about eviction for the last several years. I think after an acute awareness that Indianapolis has substantially high eviction rates, after Matthew Desmond's release, Evicted, I think we all became much more aware of the eviction crisis here in Indianapolis. And Dr. Merritt's team has dug into that further over the last couple years to really understand what that looks like and who is impacted most by eviction and how eviction can then contribute for particular populations to experiences with homelessness. So Dr. Merritt, can you talk about some of those factors that create, again, unequal systems that are disproportionately impacting Black people when it comes to housing and homelessness? And you're on mute.
I am on mute. Thank you, Chelsea. So I think, there's some folks on the call. I think I saw Amy on here and some fair housing folks who can speak to this probably even better than I can, but, just recognizing the fact that Indiana is not a very tenant-friendly state. We have tons of barriers at the state level that prevent us from really meaningfully not just tackling eviction, but definitely tackling racial disparities in eviction. There are other states that have protections for things like landlords, please don't retaliate against your tenants if they feel like they're living in unsafe housing. We don't even have basic protections like that compared to a lot of other states, including our Midwestern neighbors. And so you're really kind of setting the stage for even more complications, and it creates more flexibility for landlords and property owners to be a little more creative in ways that they can discriminate against renting. So when we talk about, even things like income needed to afford, at the federal level, we've pretty much gutted opportunities for affordable housing in a meaningful way, or they set it at an income level, like an area median income, which actually does not meet the needs of a lot of people of color, because if you're looking at it across, and we know that Black people earn less, it's difficult for developers and other, private entities to even create affordable housing options for folks who are extremely low income. And I think similarly, there are also efforts that at the state or the local or even at the landlord level that they can develop to make them more complicated. So I like to give the example of, there's some states that actually have protections from, people who have, lost my thought. There are landlords who can make, more decisions about if someone has an eviction history. Like Chelsea said, we know that people of color are more likely to be evicted. So, if that's something that you're going to go to first, to say, oh, well, you've already been evicted. And it could have been something that was not completely their fault, that it doesn't matter. That's what they're saying. And so they're saying, we don't want to take a risk on you. So that can disproportionately affect people of color, people with a criminal history, particularly with felonies. They're often not necessarily guaranteed housing. And so even if they are, a landlord can kind of work their way around that and say, we want someone to live in a safe community, and this, having this person who's been incarcerated with a felony on their record, we don't know what they're going to bring to our property, so we shouldn't rent to them. So there are lots of different ways like that, where there aren't explicit policies protecting against it, and they disproportionately affect people of color. So when we talk about, what does it mean to have a racially equitable housing policy? It's complicated because a lot of folks don't, at the government level in particular, don't want to be seen as giving concessions to people of color. Even if that's the case, it's very difficult to get that to pass, as a collective legislative body or as a unit. And so we see things like in Indianapolis where, they were able to pass an ordinance around tenants' rights. It took a lot for that to be the case. And they also couldn't explicitly say things about race, right? And I think in the same vein, even though we know those folks are more disproportionately likely to be, impacted by these types of decisions, it's usually, we see the conversation focusing on opportunity for all, which is not bad, but to really think about and rectify a lot of these changes, it's going to take a lot more detailed policy design to really think through, what it takes systemically and legislatively to kind of make things more equitable for everyone, and particularly making sure that communities of color aren't disproportionately affected by that. And again, that's not just a local or state issue, it's a federal issue. And again, they're all working collectively with the private sector and others, but they have to collaborate to make sure that that happens. So that level of coordination can be very complex, and it really contributes to a lot of those eviction level issues that we're seeing today.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt. Pastor Greene, I'm gonna kick it over to you with, we've talked as a community for several years about the disproportionality that exists in homelessness. Every year, our point in time count shows this disparity. And, I think there's a growing sense of frustration and urgency about what do we do about that, right? How do we start to really rally around what the data continues to show us year in and year out? So as a member, and this is Pastor Greene and then your fellow panelists, as members of the Blueprint Council, the governing body for the Indianapolis Continuum of Care, what is the COC doing to address racial disparities, and what should the COC be doing to address racial disparities?
First, I want to thank you, Chelsea, and the entire CHIP organization for putting together this panel, and everyone that's participating today to discuss this important topic of homelessness, housing, and racial inequity. I'm happy to inform everyone that the Blueprint Council has recently formed a racial equity work group to begin to address this issue. This work group is new and it's growing, and while we're in the beginning stages, you can expect to hear more from the group as we're going to quickly work on developing a racial equity statement, but more importantly, develop outcome measures that will help this community become a more equitable community. And we understand that there has to be a matrix that that's going to help guide the COC and all of its members and our community. And when I think about that, as we're at this stage, it's the one term that keeps occurring in my mind is reset. And reset really, for me, is an acronym. R represents that we reevaluate, we reimagine. So we're looking at things like the VI SPDAT. And is that scoring tool contributing to inequity? Are there changes that need to be made? So are we reevaluate, we reimagine? I want to challenge all the organizations that are listening, begin to reevaluate, reimagine. E represents what's essential. What do we really need? And if we're going to address this issue, what needs to be eliminated? We got to look at both of those items. The S represents strategy. What is going to be our strategy? This work group will be working on that. Hopefully organizations and individuals will begin to think, what is the strategy to address the racial inequality? The other E is, how do we evolve? How do we expand? Because we need to do that. And in doing that, we have to look for solutions and not look for excuses. For example, organizations can look and say, well, we can't really add diversity to our board because we'd have to get rid of somebody that we value. Well, how about you keep the people that you value, but you're intentional about saying we're going to add 3 new members or some number that's going to be diverse so that we can expand, so we can evolve and bring those voices to the table. And the T represents team. And you got to evaluate who's going to be on the team, what changes need to be made. So we're at a stage, and it's crucial, and COVID-19 probably drives it even more, that we have to do this reset. Now, we don't get there overnight, but we do have to be very intentional about getting there as quick as possible, focusing on how we're going to reinvent ourselves and be successful about this particular task. Yeah, there's some thinking out of the box, clearly, and we need to do that. And for organizations who have some diversity within their organization already, they still have to evaluate and say, have we created a culture and a climate where those diverse voices can be heard? Are they in places where they can be heard? Do they feel comfortable they can share without, being punished for sharing their comments or thoughts? This is all part of it. We're getting started. There's a lot of work to be done, but I would go back. This has to be intentional, and there has to be some expediency to which we accomplish the task, so we don't wake up 3 years from now saying we're really at the same spot.
Thank you, Pastor Greene. And I hope everyone wrote down reset and what that stands for, and becomes a conversation you take back to your own organization to start to have that dialogue internally about the questions Pastor Greene posed to everyone. This work, as you just heard Pastor Greene say, this is our collective work, all of our collective work. This does not fall solely on the shoulders of the Blueprint Council or a racial equity work group, but collectively our work to do together. So in kind of along those lines, and this is open to any of the panelists, who else needs to be at the table? We tend to sometimes work in our sectors and our silos and try to address this work in sometimes fragmented ways. So who else needs to be at the table to continue advancing not only dialogue, but action around racial equity here in Indianapolis?
I would like to add that maybe we should bring in the legislature and hopefully also here in Indiana Civil Liberties Union, for the simple reason that this is going to take quite a bit. We're going to need more of the landlords and employers.
So yeah, go ahead.
Please forgive me. And also, specifically, some more of the departments here in the state. Specifically, I'm going to speak about 2. Those 2 are, as Dr. Merritt alluded to, the Indiana Division of Mental Health and Addiction, and also the Indiana Department of Corrections. They need to be at the table. Unfortunately, I spent 7 years of my life at the Indiana State Prison, and because of my mental health condition, which was not addressed while I was on active duty, as Dr. Merritt alluded to. But that's okay. I refuse to be bitter. I believe in being proactive, and that proactive is to work with others and hopefully help them to also get to where I'm at and beyond. So I do believe that they most definitely should be at the table. And one of the most ironic things that I do see is the fact that at the Indiana Government Center, they are both on the 3rd floor, literally back to each other, but very seldom talk. So they most definitely need a seat at the table.
Absolutely. And I think the Blueprint is going to be doing some recruiting coming up in 2021 to really extend invitations to those cross-system partners that, as you all are touching on, homelessness does not happen in a vacuum. It is the consequence of other breakdowns in other systems. And so having those system players at the table is a critical piece to changing culture and changing policy and changing the questions that we're asking.
If I could add, Chelsea, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think, Ray brought up some really great organizations, and I think Pastor Greene alluded to the racial equity group in the Blueprint Council. I think one thing that we've talked about is the role of, the fact that so many service providers, as well as a lot of the groups that Ray mentioned, don't actually know a lot about racial equity or their role in it. And so it kind of, while there are different important sectors to bring to the table, I think to Pastor Greene's point, there needs to be a reset generally about even what it means to pursue racial equity as a goal, both in terms of policy, in terms of practice, in terms of representation among providers. And that's kind of a top to bottom approach that even if, CHIP is taking this role and finding the right people to bring to the table, I think CHIP also is trying to be intentional in who those people are that really can speak to and enhance those solutions, because just bringing folks to the table who aren't really in a space to engage these critical topics, it kind of doesn't matter. Even though they're an important part of the puzzle, they just may not be able to really meaningfully do that. And so I think there's kind of a top to bottom thing that needs to happen locally, where folks need to take it more seriously and understand their part in perpetuating some of those disparities.
Absolutely, Dr. Merritt. And framing that conversation. We can't have the same conversation over and over and expect a different outcome. So how do we ensure we're asking the right questions and we understand what equity work actually means in a meaningful way? Any other panelists, Pastor Greene or William, do you want to contribute to who else needs to be at the table that maybe isn't, or that we need to start aligning work with places that this is happening across the city that maybe isn't connected right now?
Yeah, I think that, for the most part, I think everybody mentioned a lot of good places and good organizations who need to be involved. I think that one thing that I started to think about as we started looking at this, and it kind of goes with other things that we talked about, I think that in my opinion, right, anybody who cares about the situation needs to be at the table, right? In some capacity, some way. In dealing with Blueprint and dealing with COC, there's multiple ways for anybody out in the community who wants to get involved with helping the homeless out, right? I think that I've seen so many people who, one of the things that we offer here at Wheeler Mission is we offer volunteer services, right? And a lot of times we get volunteers who come in and just spend time with guys, right? And they show that they care, and they show that there's another way, and they show that, hey, we can get you to help, and they show those things. And I've seen so many guys who were, when they came here, they were hopeless, right? A lot of guys, if you know the homeless system, right, a lot of guys have lost their respect for some of those agencies, right? Or they just tapped out, right? You've been in mental health services for the last 20 years, and you ain't getting better. You, in your mind, you're getting worse, right? It's like, at some point you just say, hey, listen, I don't want that help. I've been down that road and I don't want it. And I've seen so many people who just have somebody come along right beside them and care for them and walk them back to those steps. And I mean, heck, come pick them up and take them to church, right? Come pick them up and take them to lunch. And those things show that care right there in so many cases, right, has shown that you are not alone in this fight in dealing with homelessness, right? And Wheeler Mission alone is not alone in this fight. And that care has gone a lot of ways. And I think that, and I've always been an advocate for anyone who just has a passion to help, they should get involved. And I always think about when I was a kid, my mother and my father used to come to the mission. It was Lighthouse at that time. And they would come to the mission and we would have to come with them. Now, if you know anything about me, I couldn't stay in church as a kid because we were there 9 days a week, right? I know it's only 7, but it was all the time. But I remembered how when my mother would come in and talk to the guys, how they would have smiles. And I would think when I was a kid, right, like how they smiling when they're going through this, right? And I never knew that 15 years later, 20 years later, that I would be back in that same shelter, you know, doing those same things that my mother always taught me, right? And again, from a religious standpoint, we operate and we go by love, right? And love is helping that neighbor no matter what that neighbor has going on. And I think that that's important when we talk about who needs to be at the table, because I think you mentioned it earlier. This is a everybody problem. This is not just CLC. This is not just Blueprint. This is not just Marion County Health Department. This is not just, right, an individual group. This is a everybody problem. And I think that everybody showing that love can help in some way across the board.
William, thank you for that. And I want to just kind of reiterate some really important points that you just made. And part of it is maybe the question is not who should be at the table, but where are the tables that we all should be at? And I think that's a different conversation, right? And what I think you're highlighting is the best way to really understand the brokenness of the system is to talk to those that are impacted by it and that are living in a broken system, and to hear from the people that are in the circumstance who can very probably quickly and easily say, here's what doesn't work. I can tell you what doesn't work because I'm living it and it's not working. And so I think that's an important reframing, William, is where are those tables? And sometimes, depending on the answer to that, is what voices are there and what voices aren't. And so really making sure that voices of those and experience of those that are most impacted by inequity and disparity are the ones framing the discussion. So with that, I would like to ask, and this is, William, if you want to continue on this so we can open it up to the panel. What are some of the strategies or solutions you would like to see here in Indianapolis to begin to address disparities across our system? Where are some places, some things that you see might be working, might be at least challenging some of the status quo? What are some of those strategies we should be really thinking about?
Thanks, Chelsea. I think first I wanted to say this earlier. I think Dr. Merritt got the cheat code to this conversation. I mean, she was giving out information and she was right on point, right? I think that when we talk about solutions, right, I think the one thing we have to understand and that we see now is that we're talking about it now, right? For so long, we was having conversations in little areas, right? In different areas, and it would come up in a meeting and we would address it for a second, right? But then we'll say, all right, cool. I think that now that there is a focus on the disparity, right? Because again, it is a problem. And I'm not saying that Black folks should get more than anybody else, right? Because of those numbers. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it's been a problem. It's always been a problem. And now that we are finally starting to address it, I think that we are starting to move in a good direction. Now, what I think that's going to help is I think that there are a lot of people who or a lot of organizations who may need to do hey, do we need to reorganize our thought process on this, right? Do we need to change our missions? Do we need to change strategies? Do we need to change ideology to fit into what's actually happening right now? How can, if we say that we really want to end homelessness, right, and we really want to help people out, then what does that actually look like, right? You think about, again, we've talked and we've known for a while that the criminal justice system is disproportionately all for African Americans. At some point, we got to stop talking about that. And we got to do it, right? So, what does that look like? Who starts that conversation? Who and not just start the conversation, but who actually does some movement on the conversation, right? Who actually says, all right, we've been talking about this for a while. Let's do this, right? I mean, because you see how that plays across the board. I have several guys who stay at the shelter who work good jobs, right? Making lots of money and taking care of things and all that stuff. And they can't, I mean, got money saved up and they can't get an apartment or a house because of their criminal record, right? Well, I mean, hey, if that, and I know I'm thinking of one guy who his criminal record is 12 years old. So he's still dealing with that, right? He's still dealing with that from 12 years ago. And he's not only did he changed his life. And not only did he refocus his life, he was a career criminal, right? And he changed his life. And for the last 12 years, he's been working, a working citizen, very respectful, got himself together. And if he didn't tell you that he was in prison, you wouldn't even know. But he still has to deal with trying to figure out where he's gonna stay at, where he's gonna, where he's gonna live. And I think that when we talk about solutions, we got to talk about, again, not just talking about them, but actually saying, hey, let's move forward. We mentioned the racial equity group that the blueprint has come up with. I think that's a step in saying, hey, listen, let's move forward. And again, I think that one thing we got to always deal with when we talk about the racial conversation is the uncomfortableness of it, right? Not everybody wants to deal with it because it is uncomfortable, but for lack of a better term right now, it is what it is. This is what we've come to, this is where it is, and we have to address the problem, because if we don't address the problem now, we'll have to address it at some point, because it's not getting better, it's getting worse, right? So we have to address it, and we have to think about solutions. I think that when we talk about what do we want to see done in Indiana, I think that, or Indianapolis, I think that another thing that I've seen is that, not everybody recognizes it as a problem. And to me, that in itself is a problem, right? If you don't recognize a problem, it's clearly, they always talk about the elephant in the room. Listen, this is an elephant in the room. This is a herd of elephants in the room, right? And if we don't all recognize that as a community, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, this is everybody's problem. So if we don't all recognize that and find ways and strategies to deal with it as a people, right, then it's going to get worse, man. And my prayer is that you always have organizations like Willa mentioned, like CHIP, like Horizon House, right, like Poor House, who are ready to put in that fight, even though that fight, if we don't change some stuff, even though that fight is going to get a lot more difficult, because you're going to deal with a whole lot more numbers. I think that we are, as a city, are solution based. We just got to start with those solutions, start doing them.
Thank you, William. Dr. Merritt?
No, I just think there's kind of two big pieces to this conversation that I think are important. One, and Chelsea, you kind of tried to set us off in this direction that, I think a lot of times in Indy in particular, historically, there's been the conflating of poverty and race. And really being honest, and that's why William's saying it's uncomfortable, because I think for so long we've rested on low income populations, but it's not just an income issue like everyone's been saying. And so moving beyond that to really think about, what strategic specific parts of these systems are contributing to these disparities. And I think one big thing that I've heard a lot of, folks in not just service provision, but, leaders of organizations, because it's just easier to talk about poverty than it is about race. And I think being unafraid to move away from that conversation is critical to being real about solutions. And I think William brought up a great point earlier about just engaging people who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability generally, because there are folks that I work with at the organizational level who I like interpersonally. I think they're doing a good job. But then you talk to someone who's, struggling in different ways. Like William said, they'll tell you, I didn't like going to this place because I felt a certain way, or I didn't think my needs were being met in this way. And too often when we have these conversations, they're just, again, they're not at the table, like both of you said. And so how do we really thoughtfully bring people to the table, not just folks who we think, are at a certain level of polish, or, the ability to really bring in that stuff in a way that, we might be used to at a high level, but like real people who are like seriously, who can provide really meaningful and thoughtful direction, being serious about continuously engaging them, like the COC tries to do. And I think there are folks who are in some of these leadership positions who would benefit from having more one-on-one time, or, group time with folks who are living this day to day right now, and not waiting for people like us to communicate, what they're dealing with. And so I think to both of your points, to the extent that we engage them and engage people of color who are experiencing that in particular, is going to be really crucial for thinking about real solutions that work.
Thank you, Dr. Merritt. So we have one more question for the panel, and then can address some of the comments or questions in chat. So the last question I think is really important. And the question is, what other questions should we be asking ourselves? What are the critical questions that people on this call, going back to their agencies, their organizations, should be asking?
Chelsea, I'll go. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. The real question is whether we have the will." And for me, that's the question today. Do we have the will to address the racial inequity? And every organization and every individual must answer that question.
Thank you very much, dear Pastor Greene. I would just like to add right quick, what some of the questions that we should be asking is, why are not more persons of color who are experiencing homelessness also at the table?
Yep. So do we have the will? And really honestly ask yourselves, your leaders, your colleagues, do we have the will to take this on? Knowing it's going to get uncomfortable, knowing we're going to have to really look deep at practices, at policies that are embedded in our organizations, and that it's going to force a lot of folks to do things differently. Do you have the will to take that on? The messiness, the commitment. Are you engaging the right voices? Are you actually seeking out, listening, and really hearing the people who know what's wrong with our systems because they're living it and they're being impacted by it every day? Other questions, panel, that you want people to be reflecting on or asking when they leave here today?
Just to piggyback on what I had just said, those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution.
Absolutely, Ray.
And I'll kind of add, my thought kind of goes with, you know, in terms of thinking about the question, right? The question, I only say this because I ask myself this all the time. And that question is, what are you doing, right? And the reason why is because there's so many people out here who are experiencing homelessness. And there's so many people out here who don't deserve, right, to be experiencing that homelessness. And it's like, every day I ask myself when I come to work is, did you do something today, right, to help at least one person, right? Because the only way we're going to do this is we're going to do it one person at a time, right? And the reason why we do it one person at a time is because every single person that comes into homelessness has their own single issue that you got to deal with, right? So I got to get you all the way situated before I can get you to a point to where I can get you housed or where I can get you to that next level. It makes no sense for me to put you in a house and you ain't ready to be in that house and you come right back to me, right? It just starts a bad cycle, right? So again, I think that a critical question that we as organizations, right, and we as people, it's easy to come to your organization and just go to work because you're used to just going to work, right? But what's your passion behind that? You know, what's driving you to do the things that you do? Most people who know me know I'm proud to be at Wheeler Mission and to give back, right? And to do things for people because, again, it's a passion that I have, right? So I want to make sure that every day I come to work that I'm completing that passion and I'm doing something to move somebody else forward. Like I needed when I was down, when I was at my lowest, I needed somebody else to come alongside me and move me forward. So, you know, what are you doing and what relationships are you building to help people out?
Yeah.
And I would just quickly add on to William and say to focus on your own corner, because I think we presented all of this like host of different issues that affect homelessness disparities and housing disparities. But, you know, don't jump off into employment stuff if really your happy place and the place you work is criminal justice. Like, please try to stay focused, I think, on what you're doing related to racial inequity in your organization that you can control. And like William said, or Ray said, you're closer to the solution. So just focusing on what you have control and latitude over, not so much trying to build the 50th coalition to try and address these types of topics.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Merritt. So we don't have a lot of questions in chat. We do have some good comments I want to just give a shout out to. And I think Abby is definitely really kind of reaffirming the need for advocating for stronger tenant protections here in Indiana, and definitely sharing stories of households that have been negatively impacted by the lack of tenant protections and tenant rights. So I think if anyone leaves here today, one of the things is know where there are opportunities to advocate, know where there are opportunities to further policy change. There are a number, as Dr. Merritt said, of coalitions working on policy and legislative changes. So get involved in those coalitions to make your voice heard around how we strengthen tenant rights and tenant protections to help address some of the eviction issues. Christy Shepard's definitely offering some ideas on how organizations can look internally, looking at your own hiring practices, your pay practices. How are you recruiting candidates and employees? Where are you posting those job positions? Are you offering pay that is competitive and that's going to bring more people and talent to the sector? So a lot of organizational steps, I think, that can be taken. So what I hope people are leaving here today with, one, a realization that this is just a scratch on the surface of a much deeper dialogue and set of actions that need to be developed to address ongoing racial inequities in homelessness and housing here in Indianapolis. What I hope people heard today is that these are systemic issues. We've got to stop looking at the person and making this about individual shortcomings or individual flaws. This is systemic. Racism plays into these disparities in homelessness and racism across multiple systems. There was a recent quote I read by Anonymous that said, when a flower doesn't bloom, you don't blame or focus on the flower, you look at the environment around. So we have to ask the systemic questions if we're going to start to really peel away at the layers involved here. I heard all of our panelists today, I think, give some really actionable things that you can start digging into further as you leave here today. One, challenge the myths. Challenge the myths around why people experience homelessness and find themselves living unhoused. And look to data to challenge those myths. Challenge the code. Challenge the way we even talk about race, right? As Dr. Merritt said, we often talk about poverty as a code because we don't want to talk about race. Challenge those places and call out race when race needs to be the discussion. Look internally, not only at your own practices, but your organizational practices, and have those critical discussions with your leadership and with your teams. Listen and really hear those that are most impacted, because they know, as you heard Ray say and William say, they know what's wrong and they know what it's going to take to make it right. And then I think lastly, definitely not least and definitely not completely exhaustive, look at where the tables are and how they're set. Maybe it's our tables and how we set them that are the problem as well. So we need to ask a lot of those questions to dig into this work. But I think you heard the panel say it's incumbent upon all of us to do the work. We can't look to anyone else. We've got to be part of the collective that's asking the questions and that's doing the work. So to our panelists today, thank you for diving into some of this, to teasing out some of the critical questions that we need to be asking and talking about the continued persistence of racial inequity in Indianapolis, and that we've got to move from talking about it to doing something to dismantle it. So I want to thank you all for your time, to our panelists for your time, expertise, and passion. I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to enjoy or to join us in this dialogue. And to those of you who are out there every day advocating and pursuing social justice, asking the hard and critical questions, and working to create better systems of care that are driven by equity and inclusion. Not that they're an afterthought, but that they're at the forefront. Again, the hope was today that this sparks further critical discussions that lead to greater intentionality and action. So the goal is to leave here today and continue. Thank you all for joining. We hope to see you on November 19th for our next series on breaking cycles, ending youth homelessness. And thank you again, and show some love to our panel today for opening up this important dialogue. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Chelsea. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all.